My master administrator password for cross freight and logistics was 16 characters long, and I had typed it perfectly every morning at 5:30 for the last 7 years. This morning, the primary corporate registry portal did not open. The screen simply flashed a thin, bright red banner across the top. Access denied. Invalid credentials. I sat back in my desk chair, letting the deep silence of my home office settle around me. The house was entirely quiet. My wife, Sarah, was still asleep down the hall, and the morning sun had not yet broken over the horizon. I reached out, placed my fingers deliberately on the keyboard, and typed the sequence again, slower this time. I watched the cursor blink. I hit enter. The exact same red banner appeared. Access denied. You do not forget how to unlock the front door of a house you built with your own 2 hands. I started this company with one used flatbed truck and a legal pad. Over 30 years, it had grown into a 100-truck freight network that moved millions of dollars in commercial goods across the country. I knew the operational architecture of my business better than I knew the back of my own hand. This was not a forgotten password, and it was not a system glitch. I opened my email to see if the server was down for emergency maintenance. There was only one unread message in my administrative inbox. It was an automated system notification, generated and sent at 2:14 in the morning. The subject line contained exactly 5 words. Bylaw Amendment 4A, executed. The air in the room suddenly felt very still. A bylaw amendment is not a minor operational update. It is a fundamental rewriting of the corporate operating agreement, the legal DNA of the company. And it was legally impossible for a bylaw amendment to be executed without the authorized, encrypted digital signature of the majority shareholder. I was the majority shareholder. I had not signed anything. I closed the laptop. Panic is a useless emotion in the logistics business. When a heavy rig goes down on an icy highway in the middle of the night, you do not stare at the telemetry screen in a panic. You go look at the physical engine. You trace the lines. You find the brake. I stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out at the dark, empty driveway. I needed to trace the lines of this brake, and to do that, I had to look back at the physical reality of my company as it had existed just a few short weeks ago, before any of this digital architecture began to silently shift beneath my feet. It was 6 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, roughly 3 weeks before the digital padlock locked me out of my own life. The main terminal bay of cross freight and logistics was already roaring. I was standing out on the concrete loading dock with a thick ceramic mug of black coffee in my hand, feeling the deep, heavy vibration of 40 heavy-duty diesel engines warming up in the pre-dawn cold. The smell of exhaust, damp asphalt, and heavy grease was the smell of my entire adult life. This was my baseline. These were my people. The 40 independent drivers who leased their trucks through my network were not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were men who had driven for me for 2 decades. They were men who knew every way station, every blind curve, and every all-night diner between Tulsa and Seattle. I watched Dale, my oldest veteran driver, do his morning walk-around inspection. He kicked the rear tandem tires of his trailer with a heavy steel-toed boot, checked the airlines with a gloved hand, and gave me a quiet, 2-finger salute across the yard before pulling himself up into the cab. I nodded back. No words were needed. We had an operational dependency built on 30 years of unshakable reliability. I turned and walked back inside the terminal, stepping into my glass-walled office that overlooked the yard. On my desk sat the physical logbooks, thick binders of shipping manifests, and a framed photograph of my daughter, Chloe. 5 years ago, I made a decision that I truly believed was about securing the future of our family. I sat in a commercial lawyer's office downtown and signed over exactly 49% of the company's equity to Chloe. I kept 51%. That 51% was the shield. It meant that I retained absolute, overriding voting control of the board. I wanted Chloe to have the generational wealth. I wanted her to have the prestige of the Chief Information Officer title, and I genuinely wanted her to modernize our digital routing systems with her corporate software background. But I was never going to hand over the actual livelihoods of 40 veteran drivers to a young executive who had never changed a blown tire in the freezing rain. I gave her the minority stake to teach her the business. I wanted her to learn that logistics is about people, relationships, and trust, not just algorithms and profit margins. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I saw the warning signs. I saw the way she looked at the drivers, the way she spoke to the dispatchers, the way she viewed the physical reality of the business as an ugly, outdated burden. I saw it all. I just didn't want to read the signs because I wanted to believe the best about my own child. That was my blind spot. At 9 o'clock that same morning, the steady, working roar of the diesel engines outside was interrupted by the quiet, expensive hum of a luxury electric sedan pulling into the gravel yard. I watched through the office glass as Chloe stepped out of the driver's side. She was 32 years old, wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored suit that belonged in a downtown corporate high-rise, not a working freight terminal. She walked across the concrete with the brisk, impatient energy of someone who believed her time was infinitely more valuable than the time of anyone around her. And she wasn't alone. The passenger door opened, and Julian stepped out. Julian was Chloe's romantic partner, and he was everything I despised about the modern corporate landscape. He was 34, slick, and carried himself with an unearned, aggressive arrogance. He owned a digital freight brokerage shell company, an entity that owned no actual trucks, employed no actual drivers, and moved no actual freight. His entire business model consisted of acting as a digital middleman, skimming massive percentages off the top of lucrative shipping contracts, before passing the actual heavy lifting down to working carriers like mine. He stepped onto the grease-stained floor of my terminal in $500 loafers, looking around the facility with a polite, thinly veiled disgust. I stayed in my chair behind the desk as they walked into my office. Chloe didn't bother saying good morning. She opened her polished silver laptop, turned it toward me, and slid it across the heavy oak desk. "We need to talk about the Q3 projections," she said, her voice entirely transactional. "And we need to talk about the automated brokerage integration." I looked at the screen. It was a slick 30-slide presentation filled with aggressive red graphs and corporate buzzwords. "I've mapped out the transition timeline," Chloe continued, tapping a manicured fingernail against the screen. "If we transition the entire company to a fully automated third-party contractor platform by the end of the fiscal year, we can liquidate the physical fleet entirely. We sell the trucks, we lease out the terminal space, and we run the entire national routing network from a laptop in a clean office." I looked up from the screen, staring at my daughter. "Liquidate the fleet, and what happens to the 40 independent drivers who lease through us? What happens to Dale?" "They become redundant liabilities," Julian chimed in, leaning against the doorframe of my office and crossing his arms. He smiled, a cold, empty expression. "Ray, you have to look at the market. Your overhead is suffocating your margins. You're carrying massive amounts of blue-collar bloat. Human capital is inefficient. The automated platform removes the human element entirely. It's clean, it's scalable." I looked at Julian for a long, silent moment. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up. I simply looked at him until his arrogant smile began to falter just slightly around the edges. "Julian," I said, my voice low and completely flat, "the men you just called blue-collar bloat have kept this country's supply chain moving through global pandemics, historic blizzards, and economic collapses. They don't sit in air-conditioned rooms skimming percentages off other people's labor. They do the actual work." I turned my attention back to my daughter. She was staring at me, her jaw tight, her eyes cold. "I hold 51% of the voting shares in this corporation, Chloe," I said, tapping my index finger once on the heavy wooden desk. "And I am issuing a hard veto on this proposal. We are not liquidating the fleet. We are not moving to an automated shell platform, and we do not fire the men who built this company to save 3% on our dispatch routing. The human element stays. That is final." I expected an argument. I expected her to yell, to threaten, to quit, to throw the financial projections in my face. But she didn't. Chloe simply looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached out, closed her silver laptop with a soft click, and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the calm, patient smile of someone who had just realized they were arguing with a ghost. "Okay, Dad," she said softly. "You're the majority shareholder. It's your company." She turned and walked out of the office, Julian trailing closely behind her. I watched them get back into the electric sedan and drive away, leaving the terminal in silence. I should have known right then. When a status-obsessed corporate climber accepts a total defeat that easily, without a single word of protest, it is never because they have given up. It is because they have realized they no longer need your permission to take what they want. Exactly 1 week later, late on a Friday afternoon, the mechanism of the betrayal was quietly deployed. The terminal was mostly empty. The dispatchers had gone home for the weekend, and the yard was quiet. I was sitting at my desk, finishing the weekly payroll ledgers, when Chloe walked into the office. She was holding a digital tablet and speaking in a casual, breezy tone that masked the gravity of what she was doing. "Hey, Dad," she said, setting the tablet down on my desk. I know it's late, but the State Transport Authority just updated their digital compliance regulations for hazardous material routing. I need to push a minor software patch through to the primary corporate registry to make sure we don't get hit with an administrative fine on Monday morning. I looked at the tablet. It displayed a standard, highly technical system update authorization screen. "It's just a routine patch," she added, her voice perfectly steady. "But because it alters the main registry firewall, it requires the master administrator credential to authorize the rollout. I can't push it through with my minority access profile." I looked at my daughter. She looked back at me, her expression open, helpful, and entirely innocent. I was tired. It had been a long week, and despite the coldness of our meeting the week prior, she was still my child. I trusted her. I reached out, pulled the tablet toward me, and typed my 16-character master administrator password into the authorization field. I tapped the button marked Approve. "Thanks," she said, pulling the tablet back seamlessly. "I'll let the system reboot over the weekend. Have a good night, Dad." I watched her walk out of the office. I didn't think anything of it. It was just a minor compliance update. Now, sitting in the deep silence of my home office, staring at the bright red banner on my laptop screen, the chronological timeline suddenly snapped together in my mind with devastating clarity. I looked at the timestamp on the automated email notification. Bylaw Amendment 4A executed. Sent at 2:14 in the morning. I closed my eyes, feeling a cold, heavy knot form in the pit of my stomach. The software patch I had authorized on that Friday afternoon had absolutely nothing to do with state transport regulations. It was a Trojan horse. It was a targeted, malicious code update disguised as routine maintenance, designed specifically to grant her minority access profile unsupervised, backdoor entry into the primary corporate registry over the weekend. She had used my own trust, my own hands to bypass the firewall, but a backdoor access patch was only half the equation. It explained how she got into the system while I was sleeping. It did not explain the email. A bylaw amendment stripping a founder of their company requires a verified, encrypted digital signature. Even with backdoor access, the system architecture would absolutely reject a corporate rewrite without the 51% owner's explicit legal signature attached to the bottom of the digital document. I had not signed anything. I opened my eyes and looked at the locked screen. The disorientation was fading, rapidly being replaced by a cold, sharp, and absolute tactical clarity. Chloe had locked me out of the digital infrastructure. She thought she had freeze-framed me, trapping me outside the walls of my own company while she quietly dismantled it from the inside. She thought the old man was finally obsolete. I picked up my phone from the desk. I wasn't going to call her. I wasn't going to yell or demand answers or give her the satisfaction of hearing the panic in my voice. Instead, I dialed the number for an off-site independent digital forensics firm located 3 towns over. You can change the software and you can lock the digital doors, but every action leaves a footprint in the server logs, and I was going to audit every single digital movement my daughter had made. By 8 o'clock that Monday morning, the personal side of this problem was over. I was sitting in a rented, windowless commercial workspace 3 towns over from my terminal. The room smelled like stale air conditioning, ozone, and cheap industrial carpet. It was a sharp, sterile contrast to the heavy scent of diesel and damp asphalt that I had breathed every morning for 30 years. There were no logbooks here, no heavy steel tools, and no drivers drinking coffee out of thermos cups. There was only the low, steady hum of high-end cooling fans and a bank of wide, glowing monitors. I had hired a private digital forensics firm. I didn't want to bring anyone into my own office, and I didn't want to use any hardware connected to my company's network. If Chloe had truly orchestrated a digital takeover, any attempt to audit the system from the inside would likely trigger an alert on her end. I needed people who knew how to pick a digital lock without making the door rattle. The lead technician was a man named David. He didn't wear a suit, and he didn't speak in the kind of polished, empty corporate buzzwords that Julian favored. He wore a faded gray sweater, spoke quietly, and treated data the way my best mechanics treated a transmission block. He just wanted to find the broken gears. I handed him a mirrored physical drive containing the encrypted local backups of my corporate server. I had pulled it from the terminal's physical safe before the sun came up. "I'm locked out of the primary registry," I told him, setting my coffee on a folding table. "The automated system says the bylaws were amended. I need to know exactly when the door was shut, how it was locked, and who turned the key." David nodded. He plugged the drive into his isolated network and went to work. I sat in a cheap folding chair in the corner of the room and watched him type. "I am not a software engineer," I don't know how to write code, and I don't know how to bypass a firewall. But I know how to track a logistics problem. When a shipment of steel beams goes missing between Ohio and Texas, you don't guess. You check the way stations, you check the fuel logs, you find the exact mile marker where the truck deviated from the route. Digital infrastructure is no different. Every action leaves a footprint in the server logs. For 4 hours, the room was completely silent except for the rapid clicking of David's keyboard. I sat perfectly still, drinking bad coffee and watching the lines of data cascade down his monitors. Just before noon, David stopped typing. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I found the deviation," he said quietly. I stood up and walked over to stand behind his shoulder. "Show me." He highlighted a block of text on the left screen. "The compliance patch your CIO pushed through on Friday afternoon wasn't a patch. It was an administrative backdoor. It bypassed the dual authentication protocols and created a shadow profile with unrestricted read-and-write access to the core corporate registry." I looked at the screen. "When was it used?" David highlighted a second string of data, this one carrying a precise timestamp. "Saturday night, 11:42 p.m., the shadow profile logged in from an external IP address. It accessed the foundational operating agreement of Cross Freight and Logistics." "And did what?" "It overwrote the entire document," David said, his voice flat and clinical. "It deleted the existing corporate bylaws and uploaded a completely new set. The new bylaws strip the majority voting rights from your 51% share, redistribute the executive authority, and grant the chief information officer absolute unilateral control over corporate restructuring and personnel liquidation." I stared at the timestamp. 11:42 on a Saturday night. I knew exactly where I had been at that moment. I had been sitting in my living room watching television with my wife, Sarah. We had just come home from a quiet dinner. And while I was sitting in my own house, believing that my family was secure and my life's work was safe, my daughter was sitting behind a keyboard, systematically erasing my name from the company I had built from nothing. "She overwrote the document," I said, keeping my voice entirely level. "But a digital upload isn't legally binding. A bylaw amendment that strips a founder of their voting rights requires a verified, authenticated digital signature from the majority shareholder. The registry architecture would reject it otherwise. I didn't sign anything." David turned in his chair to look at me. "That's what I'm looking for next. Give me until tomorrow morning. If there's a signature on that new document, I'll find out exactly where it came from." I left the workspace, drove back to my house, and slept for exactly 4 hours. The next morning, Tuesday, I was back in the windowless room before David had even turned the lights on. The air in the room felt heavier today. The initial shock of the lockout had faded, leaving behind a cold, hard ache in my chest. At 9:15, David motioned for me to come to the monitors. "I isolated the signature file attached to the new bylaws," he said. He tapped a key, and a high-resolution image of the final page of the amended operating agreement appeared on the screen. There at the bottom of the page was my signature. It was perfectly executed, rendered in dark blue digital ink. "That's my handwriting," I said, "but I didn't sign this." "I know you didn't," David replied. He opened a new window beside the document. It looked like a dense block of complex code. "This is the metadata for that specific signature block. A raw, authentic digital signature generated on a tablet or a secure portal carries a specific, encrypted time stamp and pressure signature. It proves that a human hand made the marks at that exact moment." He pointed a pen at the code on the screen. "This doesn't have that. This is a flattened vector graphic. It's a high-quality picture of your signature, perfectly cropped and digitally pasted onto the new PDF. The registry accepted it because the shadow profile explicitly overrode the encryption checks." I leaned closer to the screen. "Where did she get the picture?" "I ran a reverse pixel match across the mirrored drive," David said. He brought up a third document on the screen. "She extracted it from this." I looked at the third document, and the cold ache in my chest crystallized into something entirely different. It was an old PDF file dated exactly 5 years ago. It was the original employment contract and equity transfer agreement. It was the very piece of paper I had signed in downtown Tulsa, giving Chloe her 49% minority stake. It was the document that represented my trust, my generosity, and my desire to build generational wealth for my child. She had gone into the archives, digitally lifted my signature of absolute trust from that 5-year-old contract, and used it as a weapon to strip me of the remaining 51%. There are certain moments in life where the illusions you hold about the people you love simply shatter, and there is no putting the pieces back together. I had spent years making excuses for Chloe's coldness. I had rationalized her arrogance as ambition. I had told myself that she just didn't understand the blue-collar reality of the world, but that underneath the corporate suits and the polished presentations, she was still my daughter. Looking at the extracted signature on that screen, I finally stopped making excuses. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a generational disagreement about business efficiency. This was a premeditated, highly calculated felony. She had meticulously planned to steal my company, and she had done it with the cold precision of a predator. She has paper control, I said quietly, stepping back from the monitors. The state registry thinks she owns the voting majority, but she hasn't made a move yet. She hasn't fired the drivers, and she hasn't announced my departure. Why would she wait? David asked. The annual corporate meeting is next Friday, I said, thinking out loud. She's going to ambush me in front of the board. She wants it formal. She wants it public, which means we have a week and a half before the hammer drops. I looked back at the forged signature. Something still wasn't right. If she's waiting to take official control, I said slowly, then why take the risk of rewriting the bylaws now? Why not do it the night before the meeting? She pushed that backdoor patch for a reason. She needs the system to think she's the owner today. Why? I pulled my phone from my pocket. I need you to bring in a forensic accountant. I told David. Someone who understands commercial freight ledgers. If she's altered the legal infrastructure, she's not just sitting on her hands. She's moving money. By Wednesday afternoon, the sterile workspace was crowded with stacks of printed manifests, routing logs, and banking ledgers. The forensic accountant, an older, meticulous man named Miller, sat at a secondary desk, surrounded by highlighters and legal pads. If Tuesday was about uncovering the legal theft, Wednesday was about finding the financial blood trail. Logistics is a simple business at its core. A client pays you to move a heavy object from point A to point B. The truck moves, the fuel is burned, the driver is paid, and the company takes the margin. It is a physical reality that cannot be faked. I've overlaid the digital dispatch manifests with the actual GPS telemetry from your trucks, Miller said, adjusting his glasses and pointing to a sprawling spreadsheet on his monitor. And then I cross-referenced both of those with the incoming revenue streams to your primary corporate accounts over the last 4 weeks. Show me the discrepancy, I said. Miller highlighted a series of rows in bright yellow. It's brilliant, honestly. If you were just looking at the top-line numbers, you wouldn't see it. The trucks are moving. The drivers are clocking their miles. The fuel is being consumed. He tapped the screen. But look at the accounts. These are your most lucrative long-term clients. Refrigerated medical supplies, high-clearance specialized flatbeds, hazardous materials. The freight is being picked up from their docks and it is being delivered on time. But Cross Logistics isn't invoicing them. I frowned, tracing the lines of data. If we aren't invoicing them, who is? Your CIO has been using her administrative access to quietly reroute the billing architecture, Miller explained. When the client system requests a load, the request comes into your dispatch board. Your drivers take the load. Your company burns the diesel. Your company carries the insurance liability. But the invoice that gets sent back to the client doesn't have your routing number on it. Where is the money going? I asked, my voice dropping an octave. Miller pulled a printed document from the top of a stack and slid it across the table. The invoices are being generated and collected by a third-party digital brokerage. They are acting as a ghost broker in the middle of the transaction. They bill the client full price, hold the funds, and eventually trickle a subcontractor fraction back to your accounts to make it look like the route just became less profitable. I picked up the piece of paper. It was an LLC registration filing. The name of the ghost brokerage was Apex Freight Solutions. And listed right there, as the sole managing director and registered agent of the shell carrier, was a name I recognized perfectly. Julian. I stared at the name printed on the page, and the sheer, staggering arrogance of it hit me like a physical blow. Chloe and Julian hadn't come into my office that morning to genuinely pitch an automated platform. They hadn't argued about firing my 40 veteran drivers because they wanted to save the company from bankruptcy. They were already bleeding the company dry. They were using my men, my trucks, and my reputation to service the highest-paying clients in the region, while Julian's Phantom Shell company absorbed the massive profit margins without ever lifting a single piece of freight. They were letting Dale and the other veterans drive through the night, risking their lives on icy interstates, while Julian sat in his expensive electric car and skimmed the revenue. And the automation pitch? The proposal to fire all 40 drivers? That wasn't modernization. That was the cover-up. If they liquidated the physical fleet and transitioned to a purely digital network, the paper trail of the ghost routes would disappear into the algorithm. No one would ever be able to prove that the original clients were stolen. They would simply fire the men who did the work, sell the trucks, and keep the revenue streams for themselves. The cold calculation of the digital theft had shifted into something else entirely. This wasn't just corporate fraud anymore. This was a direct attack on the livelihoods of 40 men who had trusted me to protect them. "They're stealing the high-value freight," I said, dropping the paper onto the desk. "And they're using my own trucks to haul the stolen goods." "Digitally, yes," Miller said, taking off his glasses. "The GPS and the banking trails prove it. We have the server logs, the forged bylaws, the ghost invoices, and the LLC filings linking it to her partner. It is a complete, ironclad chain of digital custody. A judge will look at this and freeze their accounts in 5 minutes." "I know," I said, looking away from the monitors and staring at the blank, windowless wall of the rented office. The digital map was complete. I had the paper fortress. I had the server logs, the IP addresses, and the metadata. I knew exactly how they had engineered the trap, and I knew exactly where the money was flowing. But I am a man who has spent his entire life in the physical world. I do not trust algorithms, and I do not find peace in spreadsheets. A digital footprint proves the crime exists on a server. But if they were truly bleeding my accounts, the physical freight had to be moving through Julian's hands at some point. There had to be a transfer point. There had to be a reality to it. I turned back to Miller. "I have the digital proof," I said, picking up my keys from the folding table. "Now I need to go see it with my own eyes." The address listed on the LLC filing for Apex Freight Solutions took me to an industrial park on the far eastern edge of the county, 12 miles from my own terminal. It was past midnight when I pulled my personal truck off the main road and cut the headlights. I rolled the tires slowly over the cracked asphalt of an access road, parking in the deep shadows behind a row of abandoned storage units. The air outside was cold, carrying the faint, chemical smell of fresh industrial paint and diesel exhaust. I sat in the dark cab of my truck, rolled down the window, and listened. In the logistics business, silence is usually a sign of a failing company. A healthy freight terminal is a living, breathing organism that never truly sleeps. Even in the middle of the night, you should hear the low, steady rumble of heavy machinery, the hiss of air brakes, and the distinct clatter of loading dock plates dropping into place. I heard all of it. I picked up a high-resolution digital camera from the passenger seat, stepped quietly out of the truck, and walked through the tree line that bordered the industrial lot. When I reached the edge of the chain-link fence, I parted the overgrown brush and looked down into the yard. Julian's shell company wasn't just a paper entity anymore. It was a fully operational, physical staging ground built entirely on the stolen lifeblood of my business. Under the harsh glare of the halogen security lights, I counted 6 heavy-duty transport trucks idling in the yard. The cabs were gleaming, freshly painted in a sharp, corporate navy blue, with the words Apex Freight Solutions stenciled across the doors in bright silver lettering. But it wasn't the trucks that made my jaw tighten. It was the freight they were hauling. Backed up to the loading dock were 3 specialized, high-clearance flatbed trailers. I recognized the tarps. I recognized the heavy steel chaining configurations. They were loading massive, industrial-grade medical imaging components. That was a highly restricted, incredibly lucrative contract that Cross Freight and Logistics had held for over a decade. It was the kind of freight that required seasoned, veteran drivers to navigate safely. Julian was using his newly leased, freshly painted trucks to run my most profitable routes. And because Chloe had manipulated the digital dispatch architecture inside my own registry, the clients believed they were still being serviced by my company. I lifted the camera. I didn't feel anger, not exactly. Anger is hot and erratic. What I felt was a sudden, absolute, and freezing certainty. I adjusted the lens and started taking pictures. I photographed the license plates on the navy blue cabs. I zoomed in and photographed the Department of Transportation registration numbers stamped on the side panels. I waited until a forklift operator illuminated the loading dock, and I photographed the shipping manifests tacked to the pallets of the medical equipment. Every single image was automatically stamped with the exact time, date, and GPS coordinates of the warehouse. A digital footprint on a computer screen proves that a crime exists in the abstract, but a date-stamped photograph of another man's name painted on a truck hauling your stolen freight, that is the physical anchor a judge can look at and understand instantly. I stayed in the tree line for an hour, documenting every movement in the yard until I had a complete visual ledger of the theft. Then I walked quietly back to my truck, put the camera on the passenger seat, and drove home. The digital audit was complete. The physical proof was secured. I knew exactly how Chloe had locked me out, how she had forged my signature to steal the 51% voting majority, and where she and Julian were hiding the money. But the hardest part of the investigation wasn't tracking the digital ghost routes or standing in the freezing darkness outside a warehouse. The hardest part was waking up on Sunday morning and having to pretend that none of it was happening. Every Sunday evening for the last 6 years, Sarah and I hosted a family dinner at our home. It was a quiet, unshakable routine. I spent the afternoon smoking a brisket in the backyard while Sarah prepared the kitchen. It was the kind of warm, safe baseline that you build a life around. At 5 o'clock, Chloe and Julian arrived. I stood on the back porch and watched Julian park his expensive electric sedan in my driveway. I watched Chloe walk up the front steps, carrying a bottle of wine, wearing the same perfect, polished smile she always wore. I greeted them at the door. I took their coats. I shook Julian's hand. My grip didn't tighten. My eyes didn't linger on him a second longer than politeness required. I played the part of the tired, aging father, happy to see his successful daughter. For the first hour, the dinner proceeded exactly as it always did. The dining room was filled with the warm, rich smell of roasted meat and the steady clinking of silverware against porcelain. Julian talked endlessly about his abstract investments, using corporate buzzwords to make himself sound important. Chloe nodded along, occasionally steering the conversation toward neutral family gossip. Sarah smiled, happy to have everyone at the table. I ate my meal in quiet patience. I am a stoic man by nature, which made my silence unremarkable to them. They simply assumed I was fading into the background, exactly as they had planned. Halfway through the meal, Sarah stood up to clear the main plates and bring in the coffee. Chloe immediately stood up to help her. "I'll carry those, Mom," Chloe said, taking the heavy ceramic plates from Sarah's hands. "You go ahead and get the dessert." The two women walked through the swinging door into the kitchen. Julian pulled out his phone, instantly bored the moment his audience left the room. I waited 30 seconds. Then I stood up, muttered an excuse about checking the thermostat in the hallway, and walked quietly out of the dining room. I didn't go to the thermostat. I stepped into the dark, narrow shadow of the hallway that bordered the kitchen. The door was cracked open just an inch, letting a thin slice of yellow light spill across the hardwood floor. I could hear the water running in the sink, and then I heard Chloe's voice. It was lowered, carrying a tone of deep, manufactured concern. "Mom," Chloe said softly, "I didn't want to bring this up with Julian at the table, but I need to ask you something about Dad." "What about him?" Sarah asked. The running water stopped. "Have you noticed him forgetting things lately?" Chloe's voice was perfectly modulated, hitting the exact pitch of a worried daughter. "At the office, I mean, or at home?" There was a pause. I could hear the subtle shifting of a coffee cup being set down on the counter. "Forgetting what, Chloe?" Sarah's voice was defensive, but there was a thin edge of fear underneath it. "Administrative things," Chloe said smoothly. "Last Friday, he authorized a massive software update on the corporate server. He typed his password. He looked right at the screen, and he approved it. But when I brought it up on Monday, he looked completely blank. He didn't seem to remember doing it at all." I stood perfectly still in the dark hallway. I didn't breathe. "Your father has a lot on his plate," Sarah said quietly. "He's running 100 trucks. He gets tired." "Mom, it's more than just being tired," Chloe pressed, stepping closer to her mother. "I've been looking at the dispatch ledgers. He's mismanaging the client accounts. We are bleeding revenue, and he doesn't even seem to notice. He just stares out the window at the yard." She paused, letting the silence hang in the kitchen for a heavy, calculated second. "I'm worried about his cognitive health, Mom," Chloe said, delivering the final, poisonous blow. "I'm worried it's early-onset dementia, and I'm terrified he's going to bankrupt the family estate before he realizes his mind is slipping." I closed my eyes. The cold certainty I had felt at the warehouse shattered, replaced by a wave of pure, suffocating disgust. She wasn't just stealing the freight. She wasn't just rewriting the corporate bylaws. She was running a parallel psychological campaign inside my own house. Chloe knew that when the annual meeting arrived and she formally announced her hostile takeover, I would fight back. She knew I would claim fraud. So, she was planting the seed of cognitive decline in her mother's mind right now. She was weaponizing my own silence against me. When the trap finally sprang and I accused Chloe of forging my signature, Sarah would look at me with pity instead of belief. She would think I was simply a confused, failing old man losing his grip on reality. It was elder abuse dressed up as loving concern. My hands curled into fists in the darkness. Every protective instinct I had told me to push that door open, walk into the kitchen, and shatter the illusion. I wanted to tell Sarah the truth. I wanted to drag Julian out of my dining room by his collar. But you do not win a war by screaming in a kitchen. If I confronted her now, without the legal paperwork in hand, she would simply deny it. She would look at Sarah, point at my anger, and use it as further proof that I was becoming erratic and unstable. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my hands to unclench. I let the cold logic of the logistics business wash back over me. You do not react to the noise. You follow the route. I stepped back from the kitchen door, walked silently to the thermostat, and tapped the dial. Then I walked back into the dining room, sat down at the table across from Julian, and waited for my wife and daughter to return with the coffee. When Chloe walked back into the room, she looked at me and smiled warmly. I smiled back. I drank my coffee. I played the part of the tired founder perfectly. I let her believe she was winning, because the next morning, I was going to take everything she had built and burn it to the ground. By 9 o'clock on Monday morning, the smell of roasted meat and the toxic warmth of the Sunday dinner were gone. I was sitting in a high-backed leather chair on the 14th floor of a downtown commercial high-rise. The office belonged to Marcus Vance. Marcus was a veteran corporate litigation attorney who specialized in minority shareholder oppression and commercial fraud. He was 55 years old, impeccably dressed, and possessed the cold, clinical demeanor of a surgeon who only operates on terminal cases. He did not care about family drama. He did not care about hurt feelings. He cared about unassailable facts. I didn't offer any emotional exposition when I sat down. I simply reached into my briefcase, pulled out a thick, heavy 3-ring binder, and slid it across the polished mahogany desk. My chief information officer used a backdoor software patch to bypass the dual authentication firewall on my corporate registry. I said, my voice completely flat. She extracted my signature from a 5-year-old employment PDF and pasted it onto a newly forged set of corporate bylaws. Those bylaws strip my 51% voting majority and grant her absolute executive control. Marcus didn't blink. He opened the binder. The first page was the server log showing the Saturday night IP address. The second page was the metadata analysis of the extracted signature. That is the infrastructure of the theft, I continued. This is the execution. I reached over and flipped to the second tab in the binder. She is using her registry access to ghost broker my highest-paying freight lines. The trucks are moving, but the invoices are being diverted to a shell carrier called Apex Freight Solutions. The LLC is registered to her romantic partner. Marcus scanned the GPS overlay maps and the hidden banking trails. Turned the page again. And this, I said, pointing to the final section, is the physical proof. Marcus studied the 8x10 glossy photographs I had taken at the warehouse, the date stamps, the DOT numbers on the navy blue cabs, the cross-logistics shipping manifests tacked to the stolen freight. He closed the binder and rested his hands on top of it, then looked up at me, his expression unchanged. When does she plan to formalize the takeover? Marcus asked. The annual corporate board meeting is this Friday at 10 a.m. I replied, she's going to use the forum to announce my medical retirement and assume control of the company. Marcus nodded slowly. If we file a standard civil suit for fraud, she will tie us up in discovery for 2 years. By the time we get in front of a jury, she and her partner will have bled the company's accounts dry, liquidated the fleet, and moved the cash offshore. I am not waiting 2 years, I said. And I am not letting her sell my trucks. Then we don't file a standard suit, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. We file for an emergency ex parte injunction. I frowned. Ex parte, that means without notice. Correct, Marcus said, his voice dropping into a sharp, clinical rhythm. Judges absolutely despise granting ex parte injunctions. Stripping a corporate officer of their power without giving them a chance to defend themselves in court is the nuclear option of commercial law. They will only sign the order if we can prove 2 things. First, that the fraud is undeniable, and second, that if the court waits even 24 hours to hold a hearing, the financial damage will be catastrophic and irreversible. He tapped the thick binder resting on his desk. A forged digital signature is a strong argument, Marcus said. But it's these photographs that cross the threshold. You have physical, date-stamped proof from 48 hours ago that the financial bleeding is active. Julian's trucks are currently on the highway hauling your stolen revenue. That is an active corporate hemorrhage. So the judge will sign it? I asked. I will have the draft filed with the state commercial court by noon today, Marcus said, pulling a legal pad toward him. The order will legally cancel the forged bylaws, terminating her status as a majority shareholder. It will authorize the immediate termination of her employment contract with cause, and it will freeze every single banking asset tied to Apex Freight Solutions, pending a full forensic clawback of the diverted funds. He looked up at me, his pen hovering over the paper. "I can have the order signed and stamped by a state judge by Wednesday afternoon," Marcus said. "But once it's signed, it has to be served to her physically to take effect." "I don't want a process server dropping it on her desk," I said quietly, the image of my daughter gaslighting her mother in the kitchen flashing through my mind. "I want to serve it to her myself." Marcus held my gaze for a long moment. He understood exactly what I was asking. "If I give you the judge's order," Marcus warned, "you cannot breathe a word of it until the exact moment you hand it to her. If she catches wind of the injunction before Friday, she can log into the registry and scramble the accounts, or transfer the shell company funds into an untraceable crypto wallet. She has to believe she is in total control right up until the second the trap closes." "She thinks I'm losing my mind," I said, my voice cold and even. "She thinks I don't even remember my own passwords. I can play the part." Marcus nodded once. He wrote a single line on his legal pad. "I'll build the paper fortress," Marcus said. "You just keep her smiling until Friday." I stood up, shook his hand, and walked out of the high-rise office. The digital audit was done. The physical proof was secured. The legal weapon was being forged by a master. All that was left to do was endure the waiting game. I had to walk back into my terminal, sit across from the daughter who was actively trying to destroy me, and let her believe that the old man was finally broken. Wednesday morning felt like walking into a theater where everyone knew their marks, but only I knew how the play was actually going to end. Sarah had driven down to the terminal to bring me lunch, a quiet habit she kept when she knew I was working through a heavy dispatch week. When I walked out of my glass-walled office to meet her in the main hallway, Chloe was already standing there with her. My daughter had her hand resting gently on her mother's arm. She was speaking in a low, soothing tone, wearing a look of deep, practiced concern. When she saw me approaching, the expression vanished, instantly replaced by a bright, hollow smile. "Hey, Dad," Chloe said, stepping forward. She held a standard clipboard against her chest. "I'm glad Mom is here to make sure you're actually eating. I was just about to bring this into your office. It's the quarterly liability renewal for the yard insurance. I just need your signature on the bottom line." She extended the clipboard and a heavy brass pen toward me. I looked at the pen. I looked at my daughter. And then I looked at my wife, who was watching me with a tight, anxious tension around her eyes. Chloe had spent the last 3 days watering the seed she had planted at Sunday dinner. She had primed Sarah to look for weakness, to watch for the signs of a man losing his grip on his own life. I reached out and took the brass pen. It felt cold and heavy in my hand. I have spent 30 years gripping steel wrenches, securing heavy freight chains, and wrestling with frozen air brake lines in the middle of winter. My hands do not shake, but as I pressed the tip of the pen against the liability form, I forced the muscles in my wrist to loosen. I let my knuckles tremble just slightly. I pulled the pen across the paper, intentionally dragging the ink into a jagged, uneven scrawl that barely resembled my actual signature. I handed the clipboard back to her. Chloe looked down at the signature. For a fraction of a second, the corner of her mouth twitched upward in a micro-expression of pure, triumphant arrogance. Then she rearranged her features into a mask of tragic sympathy and looked up at her mother. Sarah saw the look. She looked down at the trembling signature on the clipboard, and I saw her breath hitch in her chest. The fear in my wife's eyes was real and devastating. It took every ounce of discipline I had built over 60 years of life not to drop the act right there in the hallway. I wanted to take Sarah by the shoulders, pull her into my office, and show her the digital maps. I wanted to tell her that I was entirely in control, that my mind was as sharp as it had ever been, and that our daughter was a predator. But the trap was not fully set. The state judge was reviewing Marcus Vance's filing at that exact moment. If I broke cover now, Chloe would realize I was lucid. She would check the registry, see the pending legal hold, and liquidate the ghost accounts before the court could freeze them. So I swallowed the bile in my throat. I gave Sarah a tired, apologetic smile, took the lunch she had brought me, and walked slowly back into my office, letting my shoulders slump. I sat behind my desk, listening to the heavy rumble of the diesel engines out in the yard, and I waited. 48 hours later, the waiting game finally came to an end. It was 10 o'clock on Friday morning. The corporate boardroom of Cross Freight and Logistics was located on the second floor of the terminal, a wide, formal space dominated by a long oak table that overlooked the working yard below. The annual board meeting was usually a quiet affair, attended by myself, my senior dispatch managers, our chief accountant, and Chloe. But today, the room was full. Chloe had invited Sarah to sit in the corner, claiming she wanted her mother there for family support. Julian was also in the room. He sat near the window, his legs crossed, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a smug, relaxed posture. He had no official standing in my company, but Chloe had listed him on the agenda as an external digital efficiency consultant. I sat at the far end of the oak table. Marcus Vance sat silently in the chair to my right. He had arrived 10 minutes earlier, carrying a thick leather briefcase. Chloe had cast a suspicious glance at the unfamiliar lawyer, but I had simply introduced him as a specialist reviewing our pending insurance liabilities. She had bought the lie because her arrogance wouldn't allow her to imagine I was capable of outmaneuvering her. Chloe stood at the head of the table. The digital projector hummed to life behind her, casting a bright, polished slide onto the screen. It read, Executive Transition and Modernization Initiative. Thank you all for being here, Chloe began, her voice smooth and carrying the practiced cadence of a corporate executive. She placed her hands flat on the table, looking around the room before letting her eyes rest on me with an expression of deep, manufactured pity. This company was built on the hard work and dedication of its founder, she said, projecting her voice so the entire room could hear the false respect. But as we move into a new era of logistics, we have to acknowledge the physical and mental demands of this industry. Over the past few months, it has become increasingly clear to the family and to the executive team that my father is no longer capable of managing the complex, day-to-day cognitive load required to keep cross-freight and logistics solvent. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the arms of my chair. I did not interrupt her. Sarah was sitting in the corner, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her face pale. Julian was looking at his phone, barely hiding a smirk. Therefore, Chloe continued, tapping a button to advance to the next slide. Acting under the authority granted to me as the 51% majority voting shareholder, as established in the recently amended corporate bylaws, I am formally announcing my father's medical retirement, effective immediately. She let the words hang in the air. The senior dispatch managers looked at me in stunned, uncomfortable silence. I will be assuming the role of chief executive officer, Chloe said, her voice hardening into pure transaction. And my first executive action will be a complete liquidation of the physical fleet. We will be transitioning all routing to an automated brokerage platform managed by our consulting partners. She looked directly at me. It was the look of a victor waiting for the defeated to surrender. Dad, she said softly, it's time to step down. It's okay. I have it from here. The room went silent. You could hear the faint hum of the projector fan and the distant, muffled sound of an air horn out in the yard. There was no yelling, no fist on the table. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my reading glasses and put them on. Then I reached over to Marcus Vance. He unlatched his leather briefcase and handed me a single, heavy manila folder. I placed the folder flat on the oak table. I looked down the length of the wood at my daughter, and I pushed the folder smoothly toward her. It slid across the polished surface and stopped exactly an inch from her hands. That is a state-issued emergency ex parte injunction, I said. My voice was not the shaky, tired whisper of the man who had signed the clipboard on Wednesday. It was the cold, heavy resonance of a man who had built a freight empire from nothing. Chloe stared at the folder. She didn't touch it. Open it, I said. She hesitated, her perfect corporate mask slipping just a fraction. She reached out, flipped open the heavy cardstock cover, and began to read the first page. I watched the blood completely drain from her face. I watched her eyes dart back and forth across the legal text, her breathing suddenly turning shallow and erratic. The signature you lifted from my 5-year-old employment contract to forge those bylaws was a clean piece of digital extraction, I said, leaning forward slightly. But you forgot that every keystroke leaves a metadata footprint on a mirrored server. The court saw the extraction file. The court saw the IP address. Julian stopped looking at his phone. He sat up straight, the arrogant smirk instantly vanishing from his face. You can't do this, Chloe stammered, her voice suddenly high and thin. She looked at Marcus Vance. This is an illegal filing. I hold the majority shares. You hold nothing, Marcus said, his voice a clinical, devastating blade cutting through the room. The judge's order immediately cancels the forged bylaw amendment. It legally reverts the voting majority back to your father. Furthermore, it authorizes your immediate termination as Chief Information Officer with cause for felony corporate fraud. Fraud? Julian stood up from his chair, his face flushing red. You have no proof of fraud. This is a family dispute. I turned my eyes to Julian. He flinched. The second section of that injunction, I said quietly, authorizes the immediate freezing of every banking asset tied to Apex Freight Solutions. Julian froze. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. I drove out to the industrial park on County Road 9 on Sunday night, I told him, making sure he understood exactly how completely he had been dismantled. I photographed your navy blue trucks loading the medical imaging freight you ghost brokered out of my registry. The judge looked at the GPS telemetry, the hidden banking ledgers, and the date-stamped photographs. Your accounts are locked, Julian. The court has already initiated a forensic clawback of the diverted funds. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The digital fortress they thought they had built had evaporated into thin air, leaving them completely exposed in the physical world. Then a chair scraped against the floor in the corner of the room. Sarah stood up. She walked slowly over to the oak table, her eyes fixed on the manila folder. She reached down, picked up the thick binder of evidence Marcus had placed next to it, and flipped it open. She studied the metadata proving the forged signature, then the clear, undeniable photographs of Julian's trucks hauling their stolen freight. Then she slowly raised her head and looked at her daughter. "Mom," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "Mom, he's confused. He doesn't understand the software." "Stop," Sarah said. It was a single word, spoken softly, but it carried the weight of 35 years of motherhood. It was the sound of a woman realizing that the child she had protected and loved had looked her in the eye and lied to her face. "You told me he was losing his mind," Sarah said, her voice shaking with a cold, terrifying clarity. "You sat at my dining room table eating the food I cooked for you, and you told me my husband was suffering from dementia. You used my love for him and my fear for his health to try and steal his life's work." Chloe opened her mouth, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. The gaslighting was exposed. The elder abuse was laid bare on the polished oak table. Sarah dropped the binder back onto the table. She looked at Chloe with a profound, permanent disgust. "Get out," Sarah said. She didn't yell. She just turned her back on her daughter and walked over to stand behind my chair, resting her hands firmly on my shoulders. I looked up at Marcus Vance. He gave a sharp, professional nod. The door to the boardroom opened, and two uniformed terminal security officers stepped inside. "The injunction bars you from accessing any corporate systems or stepping foot on company property," Marcus stated cleanly. "If either of you touches a computer on your way out, or if you refuse to leave the premises immediately, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." Julian didn't say a word. He grabbed his phone and walked quickly out of the room, abandoning Chloe without a second glance. Chloe stood at the head of the table for a long moment, staring at the projected slide that still read Executive Transition. She looked at the dispatch managers, she looked at her mother, and finally she looked at me. There was no apology in her eyes. There was only the stunned, hollow panic of a climber who had just realized the ladder was gone. She turned and walked out the door. The security officers followed her down the hall. The boardroom was quiet again. I took off my reading glasses, folded them, and put them back in my pocket. I reached up and placed my hand over Sarah's hand where it rested on my shoulder. We didn't need to speak. The nightmare was over. That night at midnight, I walked out into the main terminal bay. The cold night air carried the sharp, familiar smell of diesel exhaust and damp asphalt. The heavy halogen lights cast long shadows across the concrete yard. I stood on the loading dock, holding a ceramic mug of black coffee, and watched the night shift cycle through. The 40 independent drivers, the men Chloe had called redundant liabilities, were doing what they always did. They were securing their loads, checking their airlines, and preparing to drive through the dark to keep the supply chain moving. Dale, my oldest veteran driver, walked past the dock on his way to his cab. He saw me standing there in the shadows. He didn't know about the forged bylaws, the ghost routes, or the boardroom ambush. He just knew that his route was secure, his check was going to clear, and the company was steady. He gave me the exact same quiet, two-finger salute he had given me 3 weeks ago. I nodded back. "You can modernize the software. You can rewrite the digital files. You can hide behind algorithms and corporate buzzwords to make yourself feel important. But you cannot fake the deep, unshakable respect that keeps a business moving forward. And you can never underestimate a man who knows exactly how to read the physical lines."